Sounds good. Welcome everyone to number 4, our last technical housing code forum on the middle housing and smaller single family strategies. Thank you all so much so far for your participation. We've got a lot to cover today. So team, unless I'm forgetting something to remind at this time, I'm going to kick it over to Elizabeth to kind of get us started and move us through our agenda.
Oh, sure. Well, the first item on our agenda is for Jose to give us a presentation about HB 1220 and its implications for housing planning and how they intersect. So that follows, it's very timely. It was a request, someone brought it up at our last meeting and it turns out to have some implications. So we'll talk about that and then I will pull up the code presentation and the discussion that'll be the bulk of our agenda as the second agenda item before we do some wrap up and thank you. So, and I would also just preface by thanking all of you for rescheduling. I know that we had to work kind of last minute to find a different time for this, and I really appreciate that we were able to do that. So thank you all, and Jose.
Let me share my screen. Y'all see that okay? Okay. So I'm just going to cover the House Bill 1220 kind of implementation. This slide deck was prepared partially from the Department of Commerce. We got a bunch of information from there and how they were going to communicate with planners throughout the state of Washington. So I'm just going to give a high-level overview of the amendments that were done a couple of years ago, the commerce guidance and tools that they're working on to share with local jurisdictions, and then what the implications are for the county at the local level. So the biggest change is really in the housing goal, where they're trying to tie and change the language from encouraging the availability of affordable housing to planning for and accommodating housing affordable to all economic segments, and just trying to make that stronger. The other requirement is that Commerce is really needing to provide local governments with information about how to provide that housing for moderate, low, very low, and extremely low income households. And we hadn't had that guidance previously, and we sort of just planned very generally for housing overall. It also includes considerations for permanent supportive housing and emergency housing and emergency shelters. So there's some requirements to update our local housing element, identifying sufficient capacity of land for identified housing needs, which is similar to what we do for the vacant buildable lands model, which is more tied to land. This is really tied to these specific economic, these income bands, and we'll get into more detail on that later. Trying to provide moderate density housing options, which is part of what the HOSAP is trying to do. So we're a little ahead in that regards. We need to document barriers to housing availability, gaps in local funding, development regulations. Again, some of the things that this group has been working on, considering housing locations in relation to employment, and ADUs, which we've addressed. With regard to also included policies and regulations dealing with racially disparate impacts, displacement, and inclusion in housing. I included this just so that you can see the breadth of what we have to deal with at the local level. I'm not going to focus on this at all as part of this presentation, but just so you're aware that these are some of the additional requirements that we have to look at the county level. the timeline, this is really for commerce and getting communications out to the local jurisdictions for their plan updates. So they've been working for the last year on doing a lot of these, providing guidance and having webinars, which they've recorded, and it's on their webpage. Are in the process of finalizing some of the guidance, and I'll show you how that works for us in a moment. One of the big things with this guidance is looking at these population projections that we get from OFM and trying to convert that into housing needs at these different income bands that are on the right-hand side of the screen. The range from shelters, extremely low income, very low, moderate, and above 120. The moderate and others are, I think, what generally has been considered as market rate housing, which is what we, I think, generally have planned for. Again, the inclusion of the special housing needs and this disaggregation of the countywide projections, which it's a little different than how we've done things in the past when we look at population and the distribution of the population amongst the jurisdictions. So this slide essentially is a spreadsheet that Commerce had come up with to try to get at looking on the left. You'll see this is for all the different jurisdictions. So you can select the county. I've selected Clark. There's a projection year, so we're going from 2025 to 2045. That's selected. And then the population target is 698,416, which is the medium forecast from OFM that you can see on the top there highlighted in yellow. Again, the population target. This is just what OFM is recommending. Hasn't been any decisions on the population because we haven't gotten to council yet. But then this breaks out the future housing need at the end of the period to 300,000 units, and it's broken into these bands. And so it's sort of displaying how much housing we need at those different income bands. The other thing to note is that the new amount of housing that we have to accommodate for in this to the 2020 to 2045 period will be, our comp plan is going to be 2025 to 2045, but they're using census numbers. So this 106,000 is looking at the population that's coming and also to backfill some of the housing deficit that we've experienced. That 106,000 housing number, I'll give you a little context of that. But what I wanted to point out was that these lower income categories, the below 80%, makes up roughly 49% of the housing that needs to be accommodated in this next 20-year planning cycle. And then in terms of the number, the 106,000, in comparison, in the last 30 years, we've added 102,000 housing units. So this is a lot of housing over a 20-25 year period. So the next item is the, so we have these income bands, and so how do we translate those income bands into types of land and land zoned appropriately? So this is just kind of a flow chart that they had, that Commerce has come up with, and it's looking at summarizing land capacity by zone. If you're familiar with our vacant buildable lands model, it's not really done that way. It's done by comp plan designation, although we have been moving, we can get the data and extract it so we can calculate this by zoning. And we have done that towards the end of our buildable lands report update. We worked with GIS to be able to get data, our vacant lands information by zoning. So that's going to help us significantly. And so this works you through the categorization and how you can get to these, what our capacity is, and then be able to compare it to how much we have on hand. And this next slide kind of bridges that gap until you can see on the left-hand side some of the single-family zones. Again, this is a chart that Commerce had come up with. I included some of our local zones. It's not encompassing of all of them, but just as an example where they would fit in these categories that are sort of on the right-hand side, whether it's a low density, moderate density, low rise, and the types of housing types that are allowed, and then the density levels. And then on the next slide, that kind of fits into those low density on the left-hand side, those zone categories. Again, with the typical housing types allowed and where they're likely to fall in terms of the income threshold on those income bands. One of the things that we'll see is that essentially the low density and moderate density, what we've been discussing and talking about, really the townhomes, duplex, triplex, quadplex that meet that 80 to 120% band. And it's that moderate density, which would kind of fit into that multifamily residential. And what we're, some of the things that are being proposed is trying to expand those types of housing types into our single family zones where we have the bulk of our land. Let's see, so go back here. So in terms of the low income housing types, that would really fit into sort of the more higher multifamily residential, the R22, will R18 probably, and some of the R12 categories. So, given the information we're getting from the state, and it just seems like in looking at recommendations to take to council from what we've looked at, our urban medium zones and designations would, it seems like it plays a dual role, both providing those lower density townhouse type of things, and then sort of the walk up 2 to 3 story apartment buildings. And so it seems like it would make sense for us to pull back a little bit before we take recommendations to council and consider the second group that we're going to be working on, so we can look at this really more holistically, given what direction we're getting from the state in terms of trying to provide enough housing for those lower income bands. So that's all I have in terms of presentation. If anybody has any questions, discussion.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, my only comment, Jose, is just that, I mean, GIN Group does a lot of single family homes in the R18 and R22 zone in the city and in the county when we can find the land, although we're typically outbid by multifamily developers. But that is an area. I've got a project in the city right now. It's a 20 lot subdivision, narrow detached homes. The homes are 15 feet wide, which you see a lot of in Portland, not so much here. But we're going to try to hit the market, a home ownership market for those at $400,000 a unit. So those middle density zones are also a way to provide potential avenues to affordable home ownership, not just rental and other tenure. And there is a scarcity of
Right.
that
Yeah.
zoning available, which impacts both the ownership and the rental market.
Yes, understood. Everyone's competing for the same limited supply.
I think one of the challenges too is, it's hard to build affordable housing if you can't build affordably. And there's so many other things right now working against the cost of homes. Anything from, in our area, definitely the supply constraint and the cost of land, labor shortages, materials, new codes that add a lot of cost to a new home, impact fees, everything just add up. And when you look at the amount of people that get priced out as these new codes and things go into effect, and it just raises the cost. And it's getting really, really difficult to build anything that even the medium income families can afford when you start looking at what goes into the cost of a home.
Yeah, I mean, these homes, as I said, that we're looking at for these 15 wide detached 2-story narrow homes on small lots are, like I said, we're working very, very hard to get to $400,000 on those. And those homes are one of 3 projects we're looking at, working with Vancouver Housing Authority and Proud Ground and Evergreen Habitat for Humanity to get into basically a down payment assistance program with those agencies to purchase these homes. But believe it or not, it's tough to build a home and hit that even $400,000 at this point. It's pretty hard.
Ron?
Oh, yeah. I think part of this is the idea that we aren't getting out of the model enough of how we've been developing over the last couple of decades. I think we should be looking at maybe changing up some of this. I noticed that cottage housing didn't make any of your presentation. You had condos in there, but I think if the public is willing to shrink their footprint and just like Phil was saying, get down into a smaller footprint, I think there's opportunities to get back down into the price ranges where we're saying 80% AMI. So what that's like $73,000 a year. If you are able to be in that range, there should be some product that the county can help facilitate. And that's going to happen in the context of how liberal you are willing to be with some of the development standards and regulations. So I know a lot of what we're looking at, in the context of infill, is it going to be a small number? But I think just like Phil was discussing, if we're able to have smaller lots, narrow footprints, maybe it's 2-story models, but very narrow, there is probably a lot of demand, and you can create a format where they can go either as rentals or as home ownership models, depending upon how the developer wants to go. But right now, I think just like Eric said, I think we haven't been able to loosen up enough to make these things pencil out. And realistically, if we look at the land supply, we're going to have to open up some designations, and we're going to have to get creative with what we're requiring. So I think going forward, we should really be talking about taking off a lot of the restrictions, unless we find that there's some public safety aspect that we're missing on this.
Eric?
So it's a little unrelated, or not unrelated, but I noticed that you had some OFM projection numbers. I see the numbers, but do you know what the percentages are?
The medium, like 1 point, somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8,
1.8.
something somewhere in there. I'd have to look.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think last time what did we adopt? We adopted 1.12. And yeah, so that's I think what we were last time.
Brian? You're on mute right now, Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. That was really good. One of the things that would probably need to have is some sort of a role for multifamily housing. I think how much is certainly up to debate, and it's not a panacea. It's not going to address ownership opportunities very well in today's condo legal situation. But at least when we're looking at some of the 1220 requirements, we don't know how we're going to reach them. It looks like if under the medium countywide forecast, there'd be 50,000 housing units that would need to be provided countywide, less than 80%. And most of that 50,000 is actually going to need to be less than 50%. Excuse me. I meant 80 the first time, and then most of that below 80% needs to be below 50. So we're not quite sure what to do. And I guess just sort of a question for Jose, for you guys at the county, if one of the things that might help us, and I don't know if it would help the county, I just wanted your take on it, is that there's other legislation, HB 1110, which at least for cities big enough to qualify, it means if they do that, they don't have to comply with 1220. Have you guys looked at that in light of the VUGA, and what would happen if 1110 passes for you guys, in your view?
I am not familiar with that. I don't know if Oliver's been.
I have been following that, but I haven't. This is Oliver. I've been following that bill and haven't given it of any thought. Don't know if it's gonna make it through the bill cutting.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know what shape it's gonna take. So my meeting yesterday, that came up, but no one really knows yet what shape that bill is gonna take. So everyone is just waiting to see by next week whether it progresses and what other changes are made, and then we'll begin to consider what counties and cities are going to do. But I agree with you, it's going to be a challenge to
Any other questions for Jose? All right. I assume then we're going back to Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. So with that, I think the key takeaway is, one, just interesting context about what we're planning for and helping us refine our focus, but also just that it changes the exact package of code that we would propose in this round of adoption, so that we take out the proposed changes to the urban medium zones and hold on those, so that we can consider it more holistically in this, broader conversation about where are the home ownership opportunities, where are the rental multifamily, how do we make sure we're serving all of the needs of the under 80%, and how are we for those income bands as well as the other income bands. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. There's still plenty in this package for us to discuss today in terms of code. So thank you all for being here with us on the 4th Housing Forum to talk about middle housing and smaller single family options. We've made it through half of our agenda in terms of numbers. So we'll get into the draft code for the bulk of our conversation and then finish up with some next steps to let you know how we'll continue moving this forward towards adoption, and then what the next phase of code development for that second package of code is going to look like. But again, main focus today is talking about this middle housing code, and we get one more chance to remember why we're all here in terms of these housing objectives. And it's, you know, it's just interesting how it all, you know, comes back to where we started when we set out. You know, we identified that these middle housing types are going to really be most helpful to address housing needs for middle income households. So that's the 80 to 120% AMI that seems to line up pretty well with this direction in terms of state legislation, and planning for those different income bands. So keeping in mind this housing type is not going to solve all housing needs for the county, but certainly an important segment of that need that has not seen, you know, as you all discussed, it's really hard to provide housing at that price point in the current market. So helping both rental and ownership, and then the housing sizes, particularly adding diversity of smaller housing that is not currently seen much on the market. So we're hoping to stay focused on these goals as we get into the details of the code updates. So if you're a code organization type person, I thought I'd just give us a little overview of all the chapters that we're touching with these updates. So there's a few amendments to the definitions, right? That's more of a housekeeping piece just to align with the terms that we're using throughout the code. There's an old definition of servants' quarters that somewhat overlaps with an ADU, and we are ready in this county to move on from servants' quarters. So going to clean that up, among other things. The urban residential zones, as mentioned, there's some refinements to the draft that you saw last month. So we'll talk through what that means, or what those are based on your input, which was really helpful. And again, we're going to focus on just the low density residential zones with this package of updates. So that's different than what's in your packet. But just that we were able to have that conversation and make that, try to work on that focus as of today. And then the heart of this package of code updates for your review, where I want to spend most of our time talking, is the special use standards. That's the way that the code is structured to provide specific direction on these middle housing types that we're proposing to introduce. So refined standards for ADUs, these compact lot developments, cottage housing, and then the new triplex and quadplex standards. I don't have any further changes to the parking code, so it is not in your package for this week, because, or for this month, because we discussed it last month. But it will be part of the total code package being proposed as we move forward. And then there's also changes to the permits and reviews, the procedures section, to try to make it a little more streamlined and in some cases easier to develop these types of developments we're talking about. So to dive right in, when we're talking about these R1, what we're terming now the low density residential zones, one of the key refinements in this package is that we backed off a little bit and had more of a middle path approach for the R120 and the R110 zones. Again, those are the lowest density. And so rather than proposing the same range of middle housing in those zones, we're proposing to include some modest lot size reductions for single family, but to limit the middle housing proposals to adding duplexes and 2-unit townhouses. And that 2-unit townhouse, the idea there being that it creates a home ownership option rather than a duplex that might be more like a rental. So an opportunity for separate lots there. But the whole thinking here is the power of 2 that use double but not more than. So some of the 3 or more unit options are not being proposed for these zones. And we're also proposing to allow the cottages and the compact lot development concepts that we've been talking about, and both of those will similarly allow twice the density. So analogous to what you could get from a duplex or a 2-unit townhouse on a single lot. So that's really the power of 2 to help us gently expand some options. We know these zones aren't necessarily going to be the primary target for middle housing and for housing that is going to be affordable to that 80 to 120% we're understanding of the larger lot context and just, but also looking to add some options. So a bit of a balance there. So curious to get your feedback. Does that feel like that balance captures some of our discussion last week or last month? Or is there anything else you'd like to see there as we move into getting broader public and then elected official feedback? Ron.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about this particular pathway when it comes to the idea of infill lots that might be in that zoning. I think we're potentially missing density opportunities. And it's going to be really lot specific, but the reason why a lot of those infill lots are still there is because they are bizarre in nature. And I guess to make them pencil out in a lot of cases, I think the idea of saying that you're going to limit to 2, you can't go 3, might be the difference between it happening or not happening. So I'm not so sure that I agree with this straight line numerical approach.
Okay. Thanks for the feedback. Phil.
I have a question, just a comment to follow up on Ron, though. I mean, you might look rather than a straight up numeric formula. I mean, you could scale it based on lot size or, have some buffers or something like that. That's just a thought. My question relates to footnote 2 under the use table, page 6 of 24, referencing a maximum of 2 attached outright in the R110 and R120 zones. How does that note work? How's that implemented? What's it mean?
Page 6. Yeah, so right currently, there are no single family attached. Well, let me phrase that again. Where are we? Yes. So right now, the only way to do single family attached in the R120 and the R110 zones is through a PUD. And presumably in that PUD, you could propose any number of attached units, but it does require that PUD review, and there is no additional density or lot size reductions except what you can work out through the PUD. The change that's being proposed with that footnote is that outright permitted, you could do 2 attached townhouses using the townhouse standards proposed for the zone, which allow smaller lot sizes and more density. And it's only if a development was proposing more than 2 attached that you would trigger that the PUD requirement would be triggered.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep us moving, but keep that all in mind. The R15, here's another where we heard some feedback when we look across the scale of the lot sizes we're proposing, that, perhaps we should be a little more aggressive in the R15. Heard some mixed interest about going down to a 4,000 square foot minimum lot size permitted outright, rather than the 4,500 square foot being proposed. And so wanted to revisit that and see if there's, keeping in mind that there are a wide range of additional options, right? Even if it remains 4,500 square feet, there's also going to be the duplexes, there's going to be the triplexes, the quadplexes, there's going to be the townhouses, there's the compact, there's the cottage housing. So there's lots of ways to do development in that zone on less than 4,500 square feet per unit. But this is the standard that would be the outright permitted for one single family detached home. So curious to get any feedback about whether there's further refinement.
What does it mean for duplexes here? So it's single family detached dwellings and duplexes. Are the lot sizes different for duplexes?
Nope, it's exactly the same for duplexes.
So in a way, you're kind of putting it on the same size lot. Say it's a 4,000. You basically it's basically 2,000 square foot lot split.
If you chose to develop it as a duplex.
Yeah.
Piece. which is
Okay.
analogous to what we're proposing for townhouses in that zone.
Okay. It seems like usually to get kind of the density right, you want to have a little bit larger lot size for duplexes than you would for a single family, but it depends. When you get to the higher ones, no. When you get to the lower ones, maybe. But I guess still, the market will kind of determine that and what's actually feasible to build.
Yeah, that's the idea. And the idea also is, right, the key to allowing the same size lot is that there are just so many more lots
Yeah.
that meet that size versus having to create carve out a little additional extra room. It gives more flexibility to decide later in the process what's going to be on that lot.
And then the other thing is more branding, because people are going to look at this when you're selling it and they're going to say that we're basically changing the zone and we're upzoning everything. And what we could, like, I guess the sales pitch would be, R110 is around or an average of 10,000 square foot. So you can do larger, you can do less. So we're changing it a little bit, but we're still, the target lot size is around 10,000. It's higher or lower than 10,000. Just maybe a little bit of way to, it was just a thought, not necessarily, because right now they're tied to a minimum lot size. So it usually the nomenclature is tied to some rationale. So.
All right, Ron?
It's pretty much the same kind of discussion. I think the aspect of 4,000 square feet then gives you options in places where you're going to need to have some of your lots end up in a smaller format. If we talk about it in terms of overall, that doesn't mean that they all have to end up at 4,000. It's R15, but if you need to go down to 4,000, you've got the ability to go down to 4,000.
Yeah, agreed. Phil.
Just a quick comment, I think related to what Ron and Eric said. I like the smaller lot options. And if you look at the energy code, once you get down to the smaller lot, you're probably going to try to stay below 1,500 square feet conditioned space, and that's going to limit your footprint and other things. But I think the big thing is that while I do favor going down to 4,000 square feet, you can do lot size averaging. I haven't read that section of the code for a while, but more importantly, unless you go back through and change the maximum density in table 4220.010-2, the reduction in lot size won't mean a whole lot in practical terms.
Yeah, well, and I would say that we are proposing related changes to the density table, so that they would line up with whatever this lot size becomes.
Okay, yeah, and that's the way it is now. Right now, I think the max density gets your lot size to just about 4,500. So yeah, if there's a corresponding adjustment, then I think it works. I like smaller lots, but.
All right, well, we'll consider this, within the whole package. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, let's keep moving. I know we got a lot of topics here. I'll just combine these next two. We heard about, these are the proposals on the lot width and depth. You see, we've got some modest reductions, but not as much of a reduction proposed here as to the lot sizes. These are both averages, and we heard last month, that there could be some further reductions here, but sort of looking at how these multiply out, all of these are pretty well below, if you built to the minimum width and depth and multiplied those out, there's still a lot of flexibility in meeting that minimum lot size totals. So I didn't have a specific proposal here, but if I wanted to follow up on that interest we heard last month. If there are specific changes to this table, would be interested to hear. And then similarly on lot coverage, this was the proposal that we wound up with, that it is tiered lot coverage. Right now, everything is 50% for in every zone for every type of development in these R1 zones. And so the initial So for single family detached, the change is really just in these two smallest lots, the R16 and the R15, to go to 55%. And then adding additional lot coverage for additional units. So that's another where we heard maybe take another look, but we didn't hear very specific proposals. So on both these topics, I thought we'd bring it back. If there's further feedback, I'd be interested to hear. Phil.
Again, I like, particularly in the R1 5 and R1 6, the larger zones. I don't know if it matters so much, but I like higher lot coverage ratios. I think we've bumped up against 60, and I think the city's narrow lot code allows you to go to 60 as long as you get to more than 50% alley load. And I'm not suggesting that by any means, but higher lot coverage can help. If, say, you want to build single level homes, maybe 2-bedroom, 2-bath, zero threshold, easy access home, you might need more lot coverage, and a smaller yard might make some sense in that context. So it's always a concern on the development side when you have to go through a variance to build a product. It'd be nice to see some as of right higher lot coverage available, so there's more product type variation you can introduce.
Yeah, sure. And I think that where we're at in this process is we've heard higher would be better, but it would be really helpful to get some specific ideas of where in this table numbers should be looking higher. So,
my input would be focus on R15 and R16 and go to at least 60% for the detached homes.
Looking at 60%. Thanks. That's helpful. Eric, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Phil. I think higher, not just because it's higher, it just gives more flexibility. Not everyone's going to use it. Some people want bigger yards, but it does allow you to do it. As you decrease the lot size, and a lot of times the lot coverage goes up. So I would almost work backwards. I'd look at what the setbacks are, and for the size lot that you're targeting, and see what the coverages are after the setbacks are out. And it's kind of proportionate to that. And then what are they before? Were they 50% everywhere before?
Yep.
Okay. So I would lean more towards like 60 and even increasing some to the R120, R110 categories. But
I mean,
R120 not going to get
R120,
used always.
right? 50, it's a 16,000 square foot lot. 50% coverage is 8,000.
Yeah, and we're just talking about structures, right? Not
right. It's
yeah,
not
okay.
impervious,
So,
it's just
yeah.
structure.
So that's probably about right then.
Yeah.
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 True. When you think of it that way, that's why I'm saying you work backwards a little bit and you figure it out. But yeah.
Yeah. And we did I know when we were talking about this last month, we talked about, can we work backwards? So we did do some of this work a couple year and a half ago as part of the code audit. So for the existing code, we did some building massing. And I don't want to spend too long on these figures. You can squint at them. I can send them to you later. I think what is important to take away is that we use the existing setbacks and the existing lot sizes and found that the building footprints can nearly max out the setbacks as it is with the existing 50%. And so with the proposed changes with smaller lots, the setbacks aren't being proposed to change. So the coverage really should continue to max out most of the building envelope. And, if this is a useful exercise, we could go back and try to redo this with the new numbers that we're proposing. But just as a quick slide for me to throw in, I think 50%, or if we go to 55 or 60, you're going to be maxing out to the setbacks pretty quickly.
Sounds good.
All right, density.
Did Ron have a comment?
Great, thank you. Ron, please go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, that presentation that you showed with the setbacks and the pictures, I think that's really good public presentation kind of information. It boils it down, real simple. And the idea then that people can start having a clear understanding about, well, how big of a house am I really going to get? How much can I really afford? So even in the 6,000 square foot lot, the aspect of what you showed for a building is probably way beyond most of their means anyway. So in the context of saying, you know, this house is large, but here's the kind of house that would probably be going on it is much more modest. I think it changes people's perceptions that it is nothing but wall to wall or setback to setback. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Yeah, and just Ron, to your broader point, we'll be talking about the public open house coming up and some other things, but these are very text heavy slides for this particular audience, but I think I agree that some more visuals could really help communicate our messages as we move into the next phases of these code updates. So we'll be working on that. Next piece, density transfer. This is really just a part of the code that needs to be cleaned up now that we have some changes proposed to the base zones. So right now it's mostly a tool for single family detached homes because other types of housing aren't permitted in the R1 zones. It is not allowed to be used with other bonuses, you know, other ways of increasing density. And so we're really just proposing some proportionate adjustments to the maximum densities, and essentially they have a maximum usable area that's the same as lot area, so that it, you know, keeps pace with the changes to base zones and correlates. But pretty modest change. We haven't seen this be highly used given all the other options that are available in the code. So just running that by you, does that seem like the right focus to keep these changes pretty modest, or is there something else that you'd like to see as an expanded density transfer provision? Philip.
Yeah, we've found density transfer to be pretty useful. I mean, particularly where we are now, where most remaining vacant or developable land in the county is fairly well challenged. I guess I'd be curious to hear from Eric how often you see this used, since you have a much higher volume of projects than I see, probably.
We use it quite a bit, especially on larger projects. It's not as commonly used on small ones because I think most of the time the density transfer have this beveling in it where you have to meet it on the surrounding lots. So that actually makes it harder to use. But when you look at the other changes we're doing, it kind of mitigates some of those things already, making the lot sizes a little bit smaller. So we'll probably use it less now, but it's still useful.
Yeah, and we're still proposing to keep it. We're just not proposing to expand it, if that makes sense. So it'll be updated to keep pace with these changes in the base zones, but not, it's not sort of a bonus on top of a bonus, like, oh, you get these new townhouses permitted outright and you get to density transfer your townhouse lots.
Yeah.
Because we're already proposing to bring the lot sizes down so much, there's just nowhere else to bring them down further.
It's mostly that beveling thing that runs into an issue on smaller sites. So
yeah,
but I think by decreasing the base zone, it decreases that percentage as well. So
yeah. All right, we'll take a look at that. All right, let's keep moving. And then this is the piece, you know, as Brian had a question about this in the chat, and then just to follow up that based on that HB 120 or 1220 direction, you know, our direction right now is to hold on the proposed changes to these urban medium zones. So that's just section 4220.020 for you code nerds out there. We'll retain the drafts that we have and we will incorporate them into our batch 2 code amendments that will be kicking off later this spring. So we already have those plans and scheduled, but it'll just give us an opportunity to more comprehensively talk about that broader range of housing types in those medium and then high density zones will also be on the table at that time. And just, you know, thinking through what that, there will, you know, assuming that these batch 1 code amendments go forward on the adoption schedule we're looking at, there will be a small time at which the changes to the special uses and procedures for some of these middle housing types that are already permitted in those medium density zones, those will move forward and, you know, will then be applicable in the medium density zones. So it'll be, but the permissions for those won't be expanded. So the changes to ADUs, cottage housing, and narrow lot development will apply. And then changing site plan review, we'll talk about that's going to be a type 1 for triplexes and quadplexes will then be an option. But other changes on hold. So getting into.
Sorry, Elizabeth, just to be clear,
Mhm.
is the pause on the proposed changes in 4260, but the 4220 changes are moving ahead, or is it the other way around?
It's just the 4220-020 that are the R12, R18, and R22 changes that are on pause. All of the special use standards in 40.260 will continue as part of this package. Yeah, so that includes urban ADUs. As we talked about, this is one of the housing strategies. We got a range of, I would say, all fairly small changes, but hopefully will help support ADUs, going to 2 ADUs, allowing 800 square feet for all dwellings, getting rid of parking requirements, limiting design standards, only applying those to historic properties, allowing ADUs in existing garages with that may have a non-conforming setback. And then another piece that we heard specifically was that there are some lots, some of these maybe R120 or R110 lots that are really deep and have the primary dwelling is set back really far from the road so that there isn't room for the ADU behind it, but there is such a setback. And so we're looking at a way that we can accommodate a detached ADU on those lots. And so there's a carve out proposed that if you have a deep lot with, I picked 50 feet for lack of a better number. Happy to hear a different number if you'd like to hear that essentially if you have enough room in a really deep setback that you could add a detached ADU in the front. So I think that's the only one where we're curious, does that seem worth doing? Are there concerns about that approach? Would seeing an ADU from the street just ruin the neighborhood, so to speak? Phil.
There we go. Got my mute off. This doesn't answer your question, so someone else might be able to do that. We've been looking at using ADU codes in the city of Vancouver, for example, as a way to design subdivisions, right? We can essentially double density. So we can build a single family home. If the lot's deep enough, we can add an ADU. It can either be a for sale opportunity with a rental that goes with it, or it could be held as a rental community with larger and smaller homes on one lot. Just a comment that thinking about transportation, driveway widths, shared driveways down shared lot lines to serve ADUs in the back, those are all issues that I don't think are well thought through in ADU code, because most of the times folks think about ADUs in terms of implementing them on existing lots on a one-off basis. But if you're designing a community, those are issues that also need to be taken into account. So just a comment to kind of think through, if someone's designing a subdivision with ADUs, how is that served? We could ignore the fact that the folks in the ADUs will probably have cars and probably want to drive and park them, or address them with the planning for the community. So.
Yeah, I'm starting to follow that path. Thanks for the prompt. Ryan.
Thanks. So I guess this is related to your question about whether having ADUs primary of the dwelling units. I will say that we've had several projects where we've had clients who are interested in doing ADUs, but because of their existing lot configuration and where the existing house sat, we weren't able to meet the behind or to the back requirement in the current code. So we had to abandon the ADU plan because of that. So I guess, as an architect, I guess my general feeling is we can always make it look nice. I don't think there's any particular problem with having an ADU is at the front of a lot. And it has been a problem insofar as it has prevented us from doing ADU projects in the past.
And I'm taking a guess at how to solve that problem is, are these lots with deep front setbacks, and would the proposed code help ameliorate that problem, or is it not the right solution to that problem?
Yeah, I mean, once again, when this has come up, it's been projects that are where there's an existing house. We weren't designing both the house and the ADU at the same time. And it's for trying to think of a specific case right now, but yeah, usually it's some feature of how the existing lot is, that the house is just set back on the lot. And we just weren't able to get anything on the side or the back. And I think it in both those cases, it would have solved the problem.
Okay.
If we had more flexibility as to where we could put it on the site, yeah.
Mhm. Ron, what do you think?
Well, my experience at Wolf with ADUs right now is that there's been several clients that have had very deep front edges, and we haven't been in a position to be able to offer that to them. In the context of even what was spoken about in the context of driveway and so forth, they're right adjacent to the driveway, and it would be very convenient to be able to create off-street parking in that context. We matched the client's frontages at their discretion. And what we've found is many times it looks like the building was always there or meant to be there, but right now it's in the back. And what we're missing is that opportunity to go in the front. We have to pass up opportunities right now with setbacks. I would say there's probably a good reason to review the idea of, can setbacks be mitigated in the context of like along the side yard in some cases. We have a pretty narrow product. Some of them are 10 feet wide, some of them are 14 feet wide, but in many cases, we still only end up with 5 feet of setback on the side, 10 feet in the back. And maybe it's something that when we look at the setbacks for the overall zoning, there's an opportunity for ADUs to be able to get some sort of percentage on that based on where it's being set or the size of the footprint that's going in. So I see this as going forward in the right direction, but I just really feel like if we really want to get some of these units in, we're just going to have to be bolder in what we're willing to propose. By the way, did we switch over, and are we in the special use and standards now?
We are.
Okay, great. I just
We're
wanted
on
to make
page
sure.
1.
Yeah, that's what I was checking on. Exactly. Okay, thanks.
Great. All right, so let's flip the page, as we say. So this is on page 5 of the special use and standards, if you want to follow along that way, or it's also in the memo. So we've got this new compact lot development option we've been talking about ever since it was a strategy in the plan. And so this is the debut of what those standards would look like to actually build one of these. So put together this package of code for our discussion. Some key features, right, is that it allows 200% of the underlying density, same as the cottage code. Oh, and let me just back up real quick. Remember, just keep in mind these compact lot developments, one of the main features is to take some of the pressure off the cottage code right now, that there could be 2 options to develop these smaller homes on smaller lots, either the existing cottage track if you want to do more of a clustered development, or this compact lot development if the desire is for more of a traditional street frontage and grid layout. So with that in mind, the compact lot development borrows from cottages in the sort of number of units that you can do. It's 200% of the density, and the lot sizes are proposed at, right now they're exactly half what is allowed in the underlying zone. And then the dimensional standards, the setbacks and lot widths, lot depths are all proposed to be analogous to what's permitted on that side. They're proposed to scale with the lot sizes is what I'm trying to say. I proposed to keep the height at 35 feet with these rather than the 25-foot height for cottages, which, is something I suppose we could discuss. But the idea, what I was thinking is that if we're going to allow townhouses at these higher densities and allow them to go to the full 35 feet, then that these compact lot developments could also have that flexibility. And speaking of townhouses, compact lot developments, these, the additional density and those smaller lot standards are specific to single family detached. That's not to say that compact lot has to be single family detached. Any of the middle housing types permitted outright in the base zone can also be incorporated into these developments. It's just that there's no further density modifications or bonuses that are proposed through the compact lot development standards. So you don't get 20 units per acre for townhouses times 2 through this, but you can for sure, a development could have townhouses mixed in with these smaller single family, if that was the desire. We talked a lot about the perimeter of these in terms of how to manage the transition. So somewhat akin to the beveling concept. And what's in the proposal is to keep the perimeter setbacks the same as the underlying zone. So that works out to no less than 10 feet around any of the shared property lines. But there's no requirement for additional fencing or landscaping being proposed. And so the idea, my thinking there is that, rather than trying to create these big barriers and block these off from other developments, that the best way to integrate them into the neighborhoods is to have nice homes and have back, side yards or rear yards, so that they're just more housing in the neighborhood. They're not something weird. They're not something different that need to be walled or fenced off. In terms of access and managing the narrow lot standards, in terms of the street widths and the driveways, all of those would apply if the development has lots narrower than 40 feet, which is going to be a lot of them, but not necessarily all of them. Just thought, why rewrite the code to try to do the exact same thing for the compact lot developments? That's just, more for consultants and for planners to try to learn and apply, just use the same standards there. And another feature of this is the compact lot development code. I didn't propose a specific open space requirement, thinking that, these duplexes, these townhouses were being proposed. Those don't have an open space requirement because it's up, there's some flexibility about providing yards when and where that seems appropriate. So carried through that same logic with this. So same flexibility as any other single family to add or not add yard space. The few key features that I'm hoping we can discuss, right, has been, we've talked a lot about which lots should be eligible for these compact lot developments so that it's a meaningful, maybe you all can help me on the sales pitch here, right? We want this to be a meaningful development opportunity. We're really trying to capture some of these smaller infill lots, but we don't want it to be, simply an option that allows, rampant upzoning on any lot where any development is proposed. So we're trying to create some eligibility standards while still targeting the lots that really need it, if that makes sense. So what comes through in the proposal is looking at lots 3 acres and smaller. They have to be served by public sewer and water. And then I borrowed a requirement from the existing City of Vancouver infill ordinance that's similar to what the Clark County infill ordinance used to be, that there be, what they define as urban development, meaning I already developed or else undevelopable because of critical areas or something like a school abutting the property, that has to be already surrounding 50% of the non-street site perimeter. And that is one way to say it's in an area that's seen some development. So I'm curious about that requirement. Some of these other pieces, does it make sense A, to be trying to focus eligibility, and how could we refine these tools? Phil, I saw your hand.
A couple of comments. One is, just starting at the bottom, I'm not a big fan of the infill development standard. In my view, we have the Growth Management Act, we go through a comprehensive plan and zoning process, and land that's, zoned for urban development, you should be allowed to do urban development on it. So I just don't see sort of this secondary overlay requirement. I understand why it's there, but I'm not a big fan of it. I also understand your point about not essentially just opening this up to doubling density everywhere in the county, although I wouldn't mind seeing that. I understand why that might be problematic. But I also think 3 acres as a hard and fast rule is too strict. There need to be, one, I'd like to see that a little bit bigger as just as a base number. I don't know whether it's 4 or 5, but 3 is pretty small. Does a lot that's 3.02 acres count? And then the other issue is, how do you account for sort of not true net developable area, once you take out all sorts of tracts? But what if you've got a 5-acre parcel and it's got a 1-acre wetland and 0.7 acres of buffer on it? And you want to double up density on the rest of it by doing a small lot development. With this code, you wouldn't be able to do that. So I think there needs to be some allowance. I don't know whether it's planning official discretion or you build some flexibility into the code, but I think at least on this slide, those are important considerations.
Yeah, thanks. Good feedback. Ron?
I have some similar feedback, I think, in the document B3 with this urban development proposition. It doesn't seem genuinely necessary. We've had several projects come in with what is described as flag lots.
Mm-hmm.
And the easement that goes back to where the development is doesn't give us anything close to that. And it's a problem in infill. And I think in the context of what we're really trying to get to, if we're at this point in time in the comp plan and we have urban services to an area of 3 acres, and it hasn't developed, there's something wrong with it that we need to help it along with. And I think the concept of giving them the density to overcome the cost challenge that has prevented it from developing before puts us in a good position. So yeah, I would just get rid of B3 altogether.
Yeah. I did mark it optional, just for us all to know. Yep. Thank you.
I understand.
No, this is exactly the conversation I wanted to have. Brian. Oh, still muted.
I pretty much agree with what's been said. I think perhaps we could go with 3 net acres as the threshold. I haven't had much direct, in the moment experience with Vancouver's infill ordinance. I know it's raised some questions and problems. So in this case, I would suggest getting rid of the optional portion. And if I guess if in addressing community concerns, I think we'd do better by thinking of ways to make the development more compatible rather than trying to construct a case that's kind of hard to see about, well, it won't develop otherwise, that it's truly infill. I think the 3 acre threshold, even if you do it net, is a good standard that gets us part of the way there. And then if there's anything we can do just to do something different on the perimeter to be a little bit to address some of those concerns about the densification for abutting lots, I think that would go further.
Thanks. All right, let's see. I think I have one more question on this, at least one more. No, I don't. It's going the wrong way. Spoiled the surprise. Okay, here's the last piece about compact lot developments. The standards also, as a trade-off to having these smaller lots, realize that the frontages are going to be more squeezed, right? You've got some narrower lots, and that with adding more housing, we heard a desire that we prioritize some of the elements that help create community connections, essentially meaning homes and porches and entrances and dwelling spaces, rather than seeing these developments come through with just 2-car garages facing every, dominating the frontage down the street. So as part of the compact lot developments, the standards include a requirement for a main entrance oriented to the street, garages limited to 50% or 10 feet, whichever is greater. A lot of times it's going to be greater than 10, but wanted to include that minimum. And then there's a variety of options to sort of limit the impact of driveways. One of them is required. It can simply be not parking in the front yard. That would meet the requirement. Having the garage set back to the same amount as the dwelling unit or further. It could also include things like a narrower driveway. It could include a shared driveway. It could include alleys, but by no means are those the only option, or are alleys per se required. But one of those treatments is required. So that is a component of this proposal. Any feedback on that part?
Could be pretty limiting.
Yeah, Brian, I see your
And-
hand still up. Is that still up, or? Oh, I'm sorry, Eric. That was just an error. Everybody's jumping around. Eric, keep going. Oh, you're muted.
And I'm muted. Yeah, I think I don't know. I think I want to reconsider this a little bit. 10 foot is pretty narrow. I think you want to go when you try to put is that a garage width of 10 foot or 10-foot door? That there's a huge difference because the door makes a pretty 10 foot is pretty narrow for a garage. And when you look at mitigating the impacts on the neighborhoods, one thing they don't want is a bunch of cars in the street. And you also have, when you have smaller units, you need a little more storage. So this whole thing about anti-garage, and you can do it where it looks pretty nice. I can show you units where they don't have garages at all. They don't have much character and they're pretty boring looking. And I can show you ones that are pretty desirable that have garages on the front and they're not limited. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of this.
All right, thanks for the feedback. And I might well take you up on those image ideas. Ron.
I'm just going to throw it out again about the flag lot and what all of these items do in that regard. I think the development, having the standards, what Eric said about garages is completely true. 10-foot door, okay, 10-foot door, but 10-foot garage, we would have to know how that's measured, and 10 foot is really narrow for a car. Variety of options to limit driveways. I'm not sure that we know why we're limiting them well enough to be able to explain it. So what we've come up with, I think, in the 4 weeks we've been doing this is the idea of let's more or less try and state what the desired outcome is without trying to give the specifics of how to accomplish it. And I think that's probably more important, and it's also what we're going to have to explain to the public.
All right, thanks. Phil.
Yeah, I just wanted to double up on Eric's comments. I think this is fairly limiting. I understand. I think what we're trying to get at here, but I think it will impact the usability of this code section. Garages and parking are very important to neighborhoods and to consumers. We try to provide that whether you're a renter or an owner, just as a side comment, alleys aren't always the answer either, particularly when you have small lots. When you try to alley serve them, one, you're kind of doubling up on the roadways, which is a problem because you've already are typically dealing with small lots, especially if we're talking about lots that are 3 to 5 acres. But it also gets rid of backyards on small lots when you're alley loaded. So I just want to be careful about making sure we can build products that provide sufficient parking and garages. And, people like to put their Pelotons in garages and use them for storage and for hobbies and everything else. They are very popular with homeowners. So figuring out how to accommodate that and still make sure we've got a compatible product is important.
Thanks. Brian?
I'm in favor of the concept, but maybe there's ways of making it a little more palatable. I mean, certainly the door versus actual garage distance is relevant. We could even have a little bit wider than 10-foot door. I do think some limiting of garages in some form, and it could be maybe every second house, so you don't get the row of the doubles kind of thing, is helpful for a couple of ways. You've touched on sort of the aesthetics and the having the street and the front service as a public space. But I think it's also just a practical question in terms of parking. And I do think, yes, most residents don't want to see a bunch of cars in the street, but I think when you're talking lots this small, it's by necessity, it will be folks with different, if not different expectations, different limitations. And so there's going to have to be, I don't see how you would design lots this small without some on-street parking if you want to get the yield. So there's ways to do it though, to try and be more flexible. And it's also worth noting that this density bonus, it's one thing to say a density bonus in the R16 zone. It's quite another to say it in the R110. And so maybe there's ways of differentiating there to make it a little more palatable.
Could you say more about that?
Well, I mean, just that the space crunch is obviously is a bigger hit on if you're talking about 3,000 square foot lots or 2,500 square foot lots as opposed to 4 or 5.
Gotcha. Thanks. I wasn't sure if you meant about the surrounding neighborhood or about the
No, the development itself. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Brian?
Yeah, Phil,
Oh, sorry. Brian had his hand raised. Oh, okay.
Phil, do you want to talk about the question you put in the chat?
Oh, it was just a comment I forgot to make earlier. Just another way to approach that 3 acre in addition to any other changes. I think it should be net or something else or a slightly higher base, but also maybe consider an allowance of using the compact lot development if you're going through the PUD process. Essentially that you can make the case, if you can make the case that it makes sense in this context on a 4 or 5 or 6 acre parcel, you should be allowed to that opportunity.
Great. The way to sort of merge the different strands that we're working on. All right, thanks. All right, let's move on to cottage housing. And thanks for your feedback, because this compact lots is something we've talked about for a while. And when you try to put it in code, there's a lot of pieces to it. So seeing additional perspectives is really helpful. Oh, Phil.
Sorry, just one other quick comment. This is a code issue. Just comparing the footnote on the use table. I just want to make sure it's consistent. I'm not sure I understand it entirely, but footnote 1 on the use table in chapter 4220 versus the double density allowed for cottages and compact lot developments listed in the special use code 4260. I just wasn't sure what this highlighted. For developments that include middle housing, the maximum density should be calculated on the equivalent lot area basis. I just wanted to make sure there was no inconsistency there or misunderstanding about what you're allowed to achieve.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's meant to address those issues and make it consistent. And I can take another read through or talk through it with you, maybe offline, to work through some specific nuances, because it's a little finicky. All right, but for now, let's go ahead and talk about cottage housing. So given that we're creating this opportunity with compact lots, what we wanted to do with the cottage housing is really refocus the standards on more of a clustered development, and strengthen the common open space requirement. So the proposal around cottage housing retains some aspects that you're familiar with, these clusters of 4 to 12 units around a common open space. We had talked about limiting the number of clusters, and really moved away from that idea based on some feedback. That didn't seem like the right way to go. But we did want to strengthen that the cluster needs to be focused around a common open space, and that a cluster can't be bisected by a road, just again to bring those units in. We had more of a clarification than a change, just that there's no maximum lot coverage, that the various the standards on the building, the individual footprints for the cottages, running through a few examples that effectively meets the maximum lot coverage requirements. Also adding some more language about the options for shared and individual parking, that are different ways to meet the revised requirement of 1 space per unit. We made some changes to the common open space so that the total amount is reduced to 200 square feet rather than 400 square feet. But there's more clear definition about what counts as a common open space. Also, this draft eliminates the private open space requirements. If there's a desire to add a yard with these individual cottages, that can be done, but it doesn't need to be required by code. And likewise, freeing up some of the design so that there aren't architectural design standards. Just like any other house in the county can be built without architectural design standards. It didn't make sense to be looking at specific families of Queen Anne detailing, for example, for cottage housing. So that's some of the proposals. Some of the other pieces we wanted to highlight. There's a proposed standard around orientation of these units. So the common open space, or the common courtyard, as it's shown in this diagram, the idea is that it's a smaller, right? We reduced it by half, but more central common open space, so that it's a little more usable and proximate for the residents there. And that a minimum of 50% of these cottages need to orient onto that open space, and all the other cottages can face either a pedestrian path or a street, so that the focus again really comes into this cluster. And a couple questions we had, somewhat related, I guess, to the compact lots is, the types of dwellings, is it important to allow a few attached units in the cottage, or is it okay? Does it make sense to keep it just single family detached? The standards talk about ADUs, but they count them as a dwelling unit the same as any other cottage. So I'm not sure if that still is important to mention. I haven't seen a lot of cottages that integrate ADUs. And just one more slide, and then I see some hands. So looking forward to talking about this. And then one other question around density. Current standards are 200%, but we did also see an opportunity for some modest further increases up to 21.8 units in these R1 7.5, R1 6, and R1 5 zones that would be analogous to townhouses. If we're allowing it for one, let's just have some more flexibility. I've seen some studies that say that cottage development can be done up to about 25 units per acre. That's not to say that's feasible or desirable on every site, but is it useful to add? So looking for your feedback there. And that's the cottage housing overview. Phil, I'll turn it over to you for some comments.
I'll try to be quick because I know others have some comments too. Going back to page 1, in many ways, creating the compact development ordinance will help, right? Because I don't think it's any secret that the cottage housing code has been all that's been available. So people have been using it creatively to try to figure out how to do small lot developments in the county. Nonetheless, they are still challenging to design. And I think an outright ban on a road splitting an open space, it'd be nice if there were some flexibility, again, whether it's some planning official discretion or standards on how open spaces are connected. I know, I mean, we've looked at designing a half a dozen of these, and you have to serve the roads, the homes typically with roads, unless we're talking about a more traditional cottage where you've got separate parking. So that's one area that I wish we could look at some more flexibility on. Could you go to the next slide?
Mhm.
I think the 50% standard is fine. Could you go to the next one? I think I have one more comment on this. I do think ADUs make some sense. It's hard to see the context where they would work, but I would certainly keep them in the code as an option. And then the only other comment I have is we do like the single family attached. I think particularly in cottage, you could have a 2-bedroom, 2-bath product that's attached on one property line and keep it single level potentially, which might be a nice option. So I don't know about a row of traditional sort of 2-story townhomes. I'm not sure how cottagey that would feel, but I do like attached product. I can also see like a cottage design where you have like imagine a sort of a pinwheel product, right? Where you've got 4 cottages built out from a central core, each on its own separate tax lot and entryway, right? That would be almost like a 4-plex, but on separate tax lots, smaller homes, maybe common parking. So I think allowing attached homes in some context makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Eric.
Yeah, I agree with what Phil was saying. Also on the orientation, that's a little bit limiting. It's one of those things that I think might have some unintended consequences. Oriented always towards the open space, or can it be the rear faces the open space? Because you're going to want access to some of them, I guess I'm not quite sure how that orientation would really work. I think you either want the front or the back to face it, but having the front face the common open space, when you drive up to it, you're going to be looking at the back of a house. And really, that's not the function of it. I think of developments like, this is way larger scale, but when you drive through like Sun River, and you have these kind of homes and there's no fences and there's these big open spaces in the back, those on a much smaller scale is a way the cottages could be done. If you require them to be oriented towards an open space, imagine all those houses being backwards, and it really doesn't work. So I would say you can't really, I wouldn't change that. The other piece is the attached. I do think there's some spaces where duplex attached ones could work well.
Mhm.
And then the biggest comment I have is we still need to fix the garage thing. These homes, I can tell you, we've done a few of these projects and they're waiting to build until the garage thing is fixed because they can't sell them. They're not worth it. They're not even affordable at this point. The projects are upside down. The consumer doesn't want them without a garage. When you're living in that small of a space, you need some storage. You need to have that storage. You need to be able to even put a car in there to minimize impact on the surrounding neighborhood. And there is huge demand for it. And it's also a very inexpensive space. So a lot of times you want a certain layout upstairs, and the garage is just that open space after you put a kitchen and living room and a bathroom on that other space. The rest goes to the garage, and you need that for the bedrooms above. So that's what's usually driving the size of it, is 2 or 3 bedrooms upstairs and a master bath and maybe another guest bath. And you look at what the space is and you project that down. And if you put in just a kitchen and a family room, which is all you really need, you have this gap of space. That's where the garage goes. And it has benefit to the development and has benefit to the neighbors. And there's no reason why we shouldn't do it. And we should fix it now with this, or at least recommend it being fixed.
All right, thanks. Ron.
Yeah, we have had 3 projects that we've had to walk away from because of the existing type of ordinance. One of them was we couldn't figure out how to get a cluster of 4 without having a driveway bisect the cluster. We could do 3, but we couldn't do 4. We had another one that had a wetland constraint. And since we were trying to have the wetland be adjacent to the common courtyard, but it was going to be just adjacent, not to the common space. We couldn't get enough houses oriented towards it to make it work. It's almost exactly like what Eric just got talking about. If everybody had their back door towards that common space, we would have been able to have oriented it in such a fashion that it probably would have penciled out. And we're looking at product that's probably 800 square feet to maybe 1,000 square feet. So in the context of what we're looking at is the common courtyard in some cases is a significant portion of the development. And I'm wondering still if we don't need to be more somewhat proportional in the idea of the footprint of the buildings in relationship to the common courtyard. I'm assuming that the, what is it called? The common or the community room that comes with this doesn't count towards anything towards density, but it would be part of the impervious surface, and we would have to be making sure that we had stormwater coverage for that. So having places that aren't actual common courtyard, but are open space in that regard, they should play a role on how much credit you're getting for giving the people open space around them. If we're not doing individual yards in this type of format, then I think we have to be a lot more flexible on how we're going to meet, once again, what the intent is, as opposed to what is it actually written out. We say the common courtyard is supposed to be square or round, but we don't really mean square, do we? We mean rectangular.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
feedback.
Okay. Yeah. So then proportionally on some of the lots that we have looked at, the 200 square foot and the necessary space for parking and so forth, it ate up such a significant part of what the parcels were that we weren't able to make those things pencil out. So I think we just have to really be pushing more towards the idea of what is intent, and not so much on giving, empirical numbers that are going to be minimums if we don't need to.
All right, thanks. Brian.
I pretty much agree with most of what's said. I think we actually had an example where and I don't know the resolution of it, where on a narrower potential site where the requirement that the units orient the open space was problematic because it meant a back face on a street front. So I think you could have a secondary face of some kind that might be able to accomplish that. I guess still some concern about going too far on the garages, particularly now that there's a more conventional small lot option on the table in terms of the compact subdivision. That's not to say that having a garage is automatically works against the sort of community nature of these kind of developments. I would just be concerned if if the garage is sort of a freebie in terms of space, you're going to have quite a bit bigger houses, I think, overall, and work against some of the affordability at least. So maybe there's some sort of compromise to be struck there, but otherwise I think I agree with what folks are saying. There's probably some circumstances in which they would need to be limited, where a road bisecting a common open space could work.
All right, thanks. Ron, a few more thoughts?
Yeah, I had something come up in my notes and I had missed it before. We've done some projects in some other places where we were able to shrink the spacing between the buildings
Mhm.
and we just required sprinklers to be able to accomplish that. And it is something that would have probably worked out for us if we could have gotten down to, like, with fire code, I think is 6 foot between buildings.
Is it 6 foot? The proposal is to go to 8 down from 10 because I had heard, I think from Dan, that that was fire code for something, but I am not an expert on fire code. And I know
Well,
that there's different classifications, right?
Sure, and I'm working with what our engineering group told me I should be able to propose in that regard. So that was their input,
Mhm.
that with sprinklers, we should be able to get the buildings tighter. I guess, let's just try and figure out what that number should be.
All right. And it,
So-
sorry, just to, was the 6 foot with sprinklers or without, or it could be less than 6 with sprinklers?
No, it was with sprinklers 6 feet.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And so just to reiterate again, as I look through my notes, the idea of us having clusters that had that magic number of 4 was a problem. And I wanted to be just reiterating again that if we think that we want roadways to not bisect clusters, let's think about, what does the lot look like when we make that decision? All right, thanks.
Great. Yeah, it is hard to. On my side, I write the code. You all have all these crazy lots that you're trying to deal with, and it never applies the same. So I appreciate the challenges you're all working with. Okay. Oh, any thoughts about this? Would a little extra density in some of these zones help, or are some of these other issues we're talking about more relevant?
Extra density never hurts.
Yeah. All right, Ron, I see you weighing in. All right. Well, thank you for that feedback. All right, let's talk about narrow lots. The narrow lot standards are already in the code, right? These generally apply to any single family detached or townhouse where the lots are narrower than 40 feet. So there's relatively modest changes that we're including here. One thing we have heard about this parking, right, that there are some different issues at play here. And so the current proposal is, or the current requirement, as you all know, is 2.5 spaces per unit. And we're proposing to split that up, that it's 2 spaces per townhouse. You fit that on, that needs to be fit onto an individual site. But that there's this desire for some overflow, some on-street party parking or a guest parking. So proposing to have a 1 guest parking space per 3 dwellings that can be provided on the street. There's a couple different options about what that looks like, the different parking bays and some different roadway configurations. Does that get at or strike some kind of a balance with the different needs that we've seen discussed around this, or are there any other further changes you'd like to see?
Phil, go ahead.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I don't have the code right here in front of me, but I think this is what we do in the city of Vancouver. I think it's 1 per 3 units. So yeah, I mean, these are pretty tight developments. It seems to work. I mean, even at 1 per 3 and 2 spaces per unit, they're typically a bit underparked, given the suburban nature of most of these projects. We like to provide more parking if we can, so I don't think that's unreasonable. One question I do have on narrow lots is, I guess, I know when the narrow lot codes were enacted, I think 40 feet was pretty narrow. I think it's the same in the city. I guess my question is 40 feet still a narrow lot, or are narrow lots 30 feet now, or something like that? So that's something to look at. Yeah, I think that's it. Again, with these smaller lots, alleys are just We like alleys too, although we like homes with backyards. They're just tough to fit in. I mean, we've got such wide roadway standards. I mean, if you've got a 48-foot right of way out front, you stick an alley in and your lot's only, 3 or 4 acres, you've got a lot of roadway in for the number of houses you have.
Right, and we're not proposing any changes to require alleys or shared driveways. Those are right now, they're only options. We are proposing to add an additional option. The minimum width for driveways elsewhere in the code is 12 feet, and we're proposing to go down to 10 feet as a narrow driveway. That's another piece of the city of Vancouver's narrow lot standards. So we thought that that could be an option. I hear you on those narrow lot, the street and the alley sections. They're in the code right now. They don't seem, I added up the width. They're not all, they're that 48 feet or 46, whatever it is. It's not much less than an urban local road. So if there's any, again, we took a pretty light touch with this section, but if there are more substantive changes that you'd like to see proposed, we can certainly consider those as part of the refinement to this. So any other thoughts on narrow lots?
Eric, if you get a chance, could you please mute your mic? We're getting a little background noise from your feed. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to keep us moving. I see we got about 17 more minutes. We're almost through special uses, which is the biggest piece of this code package. So the final section is the triplexes and quadplexes. And so right now what's interesting is there really aren't a lot of standards that apply if you wanted to build a triplex or a quadplex right now. The only multifamily standards are about open space that kick in at 12 units. So it actually was interesting. It was less an issue of taking away standards as trying to figure out what standards would be appropriate for a triplex and quadplex when we start thinking about introducing them in some of these R1 zones. So I proposed to you some of the similar tools that we've talked about so far today. The main entrance requirements, that there's one main entrance per structure facing the street. That doesn't mean 3, that doesn't mean 4, which could be really difficult to fit in on a street frontage. It's just one per structure so that there's some connection there. Similar limitations on garages. Then some changes in the standards in 4340 and 4350 to treat the parking and access for these uses similar to single family and duplexes, essentially saying you don't have to treat them like a parking lot per se, with parking lot islands and curbs and whatnot, which are really difficult to fit onto a lot. And we did have a talk with development engineering yesterday and some other county staff. And it's not in the proposed code, but we talked about how we could think, they did see a way to allow up to 2 driveways for these lots. So if you had a duplex, also a triplex or a quadplex, that there could be 2 separate driveways. Otherwise, there's only 1 driveway per lot for most residential lots in the county, to give a little bit more flexibility. So any additional questions, refinements? Phil, take us away.
Sorry, I've got so many comments, but I haven't been to other meetings.
It's perfect. We got
I think Eric's brought this up in the past. I know we built a 4-plex on an existing legal lot of record in an R43 zone just next to our office up here in Hazeldale. And I mean, we had to go through a full Type 3 site plan review, full site engineering. It was, frankly, we regretted purchasing the lot and building it. It was way too much trouble. So procedure matters on these. If you've got an existing legal lot of record, there should be an easier way to get these things built. I'm concerned about, is the main entrance to the structure itself? Are you talking about, because I also heard you mention driveways. I think not providing, if these are essentially attached single family homes, which they are, right? We're basically saying we're not going to be able to provide parking for all of them, right? If we're limited to 2 driveways, I guess Why can't we park them all? Because if they were platted townhomes, we could park them all.
Yes. That was the discussion that we had with development engineering. They were concerned about seeing that many driveways proliferating off of an individual lot. But they did also recognize they could be townhouses. So I'm not quite sure where the compromise that we came up with was 2. So you could have 2 shared driveways, right? So
Just as a practical matter, I mean, if these are 18 to 20 foot wide attached townhomes without lot lines, so it's a triplex or a quadplex, I mean, there's going to be parking along the entire frontage. There's no other way to make it work. I mean, unless you happen to have a super deep lot, in which case you can push the building back, 30 feet off the lot line and provide more parking up front. But I just, as a practical matter, I don't think it works. I don't think you'll be able to park them. And thank you.
all right, thanks. And stay tuned. We have procedural updates as well. So we've also thought of that piece. Eric.
Sorry, maybe out of place then, since you said that, but I just wanted to echo what Phil said about the type 2 process for a duplex and any of these multiplexes. Just to go through the process, it almost makes it not feasible, if not financially feasible, to do one of these small lot projects like this, like a duplex or a triplex. If you have to go through a type 2 site plan, you're probably upside down and it's not cost effective. And to kind of piggyback off that, if you could do it like with a type 1, the other thing about these multiplexes is it takes away the opportunity sometimes in neighborhoods for owner occupied product. So it takes away owner occupied product and it adds most of the time rental product. These multiplexes are most of the time rentals. If there was a way to streamline the division process as well. So not only can you build a duplex, but you could kind of build an infill townhouse on fee simple lots that could be sold and owned individually without having to condo it. That's kind of the workaround now. But if there was a way, almost like a binding site plan for these triplex to make them something that would be more owner occupied product.
Sure. There is an option. Well, Oregon invented something called a middle housing land division that does what you're talking about. And I'm not sure that the county can do that without some action at the state level with the subdivision code, but it something we can continue to look into.
I'd be interested in seeing that. If you could, maybe send that out to the group. What did they do? Because it's a constraint. I mean, I don't know how many times I have someone come into my office and like, I just want to do a 2-lot short plat. 90% of the time I talk them out of it. And that is a needed housing supply. And it's not that it's not a good project. It's that it is not cost effective. To even go through pre-app, application, engineering, final platting, and all of the other pieces needed, you're at a minimum of probably $60,000 to $80,000 into it. And that's just part of the process. If you have to construct any improvements, add that to it. So really quickly, they're not feasible.
Sure. All right. Well, let's talk about the good news here in terms of review standards. So first piece is exempting all ADUs from site plan review. Right now, detached requires a type 1 site plan, but not attached, but they're reviewed very similarly. So community development is going to work on if there's, just a different way to charge a fee at the same time as building permit rather than requiring that site plan review. But from a land use perspective, they will all the ADUs will be taken out of the site plan review process. And then triplexes and quadplexes would go to a type 1 site plan review, exactly those issues that Eric, that you and Phil just raised. So we also explored, do we even need a type 1 site plan review? And what we heard from development engineering is that is really the process to evaluate site improvements, particularly whether sidewalk improvements get triggered. And they have some different thresholds that have to do with trips and just sort of impact generation. That means that they still think triplexes and quadplexes need to go through that review. So that's the proposal there. And then on PUDs, we had talked, there's a proposal, we had talked about, could we use a small PUD to accomplish some of these compact lot division? And we did go ahead with a compact lot division or compact lot developments, but also proposed could PUDs come down to 3 acres. We have a more comprehensive implementation measure in the housing options and study action plan that's identified as a medium term. The idea being, let's get all these by right options, middle housing added, and then come back and see, you know, what else extra could be added through the PUD as a later step. So should we do anything? You know, I guess the question is, would you like to see that change to go down to 3 acres on the PUDs now? Would you like to see anything else if we're going to deal with that section? Or would you rather table all of the PUD and come back to it in that medium term implementation? Eric, I see your hand.
Yeah, it was on something else. For, the PUD, yeah, I think it would help. It's not a huge impact, but you know, going down to 3 acres definitely helps. The comment I had was more of a question, and it's the type 1 site plan. What is the process in the county terminology that they use for a building permit? If you're just going to pull a permit for a single home on an existing lot, is that a type 1 site plan?
Not
that
for a
part of the
single
building permit?
family or duplex, no. That's just a building permit.
Okay, so I really think that the duplex, triplex should be allowed under the same process as a single family home. If it's one ownership. Now, if you're gonna like split it up into 2 lots, maybe that's a type 1 binding, like a type 1 binding site plan. That takes a little more review. But if it's one structure on one lot up to that size, it should be handled just like a single family home. And I think it is if it's inside a subdivision and it's on a corner lot the way it is now. I don't think those go through a type 1 site plan.
We had a good conversation about trying to figure out what the code currently says about that. And yes, there are some options, there are some times when it works out like that. Yeah, but it sounds like it hasn't been consistently implemented.
Well, this is our opportunity to make some recommendations. So I would say that it should basically be done with the same process that a building permit goes through. And that's how you make it cost effective. If you have to, I mean, I'm talking myself out of work right now, but if you have to hire me to do a triplex, it's going to be too expensive. You shouldn't have to. It should be easier than that. And when the engineers get involved and land use planners get involved, very, very quickly, that type 1 site plan looks very similar to a type 2. The builder should be able to do it with a standard like plot plan.
All right, thanks. Ron, I see your hand.
Yeah, I agree with what Eric was saying, bouncing off of what Phil was saying in regard to getting the costs down. I absolutely think we should proceed with these changes now. And the PUD being lowered to 3 acres, I think there are some opportunities that we don't know are out there that we're going to find by doing that. So this is the kind of stuff that I think we need to be showing the public that we're really interested in tackling the problem. And this also gives opportunities for continued home ownership in that area where there's probably not home ownership opportunities now. But I think just like what Eric was saying, if you could get duplexes or triplexes where you could get an owner in one of the units and then be renting it out, it becomes cost effective for him to choose to build that. And the owner's in there for a period of time and equity starts to build, and it's all good.
All right, thanks, Ron. Thus concludes my agenda of questions. And I just want to say, I know it's a big package of code. It sounded like many of you were following along in your packets. So if you have specific comments on different sections, you are welcome to. I'd love to see your written comments if you want to email me, but we have just you know, a couple last minutes here, if there's anything that we missed in our conversation that you would like to raise for the good of the group. All right, well, let's talk next steps. And if anybody thinks of anything while we're doing this, you can chime in. And Jackie, again, jump in here if you would like to. But I'll just let you know, there's more middle housing code to discuss. We really appreciate your all's engagement with this through this forum series. And so we are wrapping up the forums, but we are moving into our next phase of broader public engagement. That's going to kick off with an open house on March 23rd. That's at 6 p.m. All of you will get an invitation. We would love your help forwarding it to additional groups, other people in your network. And then county staff is also available to attend community meetings. You know, if there's a particular group you're a part of that might like to hear a more detailed presentation on this, aside from the open house, that is also an option. And then the next piece is moving into the adoption process. So we'll be taking some of that feedback from the forums, certainly the comments today, and as well as the engagement. And we'll be starting with some work sessions and then headed to a public hearing at Planning Commission. Likewise, I'll just put words in your mouth, Jackie, but I'm sure Jackie will let you know about all of these dates as we get closer to them. And then you can also be looking ahead to our second forum series that will address the multifamily and regulated affordable housing strategies. And then also the middle housing for these medium density and high density zones. And we'll do a very similar series of forums. Those are going to start in spring. We're hoping to get those underway in April, but we don't have an exact date yet. So we will be sending out some information. If you have also any feedback on how the scheduling and the timing of these has worked for you, if you prefer to have the same day and time every month or negotiate, you know, sort of find a different time each month, we would be interested to hear that. And we've appreciated working with all of you on this. So thank you all. Jackie.
Oh, I think you summarized it well, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. And that was a lot of work and great feedback today. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate all the review and consideration and thoughtful comments that you've provided us throughout this whole, phase of this project, and as well as those that participated in the housing option study as well. So like Elizabeth said, we'll be in touch with the upcoming public meeting and planning commission and the adoption process meetings for this batch. And for those that are participating with the second forum, we'll get with you soon on when those will start. I don't know if Steve might have anything. He's got to get going too. So,
Nope.
all right.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, bye, everyone.
Bye.